Yes. So now I would like to officially welcome you to today's session of the BioClock Academy. So I'm Hannah Brooks, and together with Laura Pape, we will host today's session. We are both PhD students within the BioClock Consortium. And for those who are new to these sessions, just maybe briefly, what is actually a BioClock Consortium? So this is a Dutch project that was founded by Professor Joke Meijer and Dr. Laura Kerverzee. And so we have more than 20 projects ongoing with a very interdisciplinary team of researchers and schools, municipalities, so a lot of different social parties, and all joining our forces to restore and preserve the health of the biological clock in society, but also in the environment. And so today's BioClock Academy lectures, they are also organized by this BioClock Consortium, and it's aimed for everyone who is interested in the field of chronobiology, but we especially want to address the young researchers. So we really want to give you a proper basis and some good knowledge from experts in the field. These seminars are given every third Wednesday of the month. And then just practically, it will be a 40-minute talk approximately. So then we have about 15 minutes left for questions. And these questions, you can also ask them already during the talk in the chat, and then we will come back to them later. I think that's it for the general part. So
okay. Great. So yes, so let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Niki Antypa. She's a clinical psychologist and associate professor at the unit of clinical psychology at the University in Leiden. And she's also cluster leader of the BioClock Consortium of Cluster 2. And her research primarily focuses on the role of the biological clock and other factors in the development and maintenance of depression and suicide. And she investigates also interventions to help promote a healthier biological clock. And I don't want to take too much away of the introduction, but welcome, Niki. The floor is yours, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for inviting me to give this webinar. I know that the original title was, I think, clocks and mental health, or it was a bit more general in the advertisement. I will be focusing more on clocks in depression because that's my area of expertise. Of course, clocks are important in also other mental health areas like Alzheimer's disease. There's increasing research and mild cognitive impairment, and also ADHD, bipolar disorder. So thoughts for future webinars. So I would like to start with a case. If my mouse allows me to move this. So we'll start with the case of Sarah, who is suffering from, for the past 2 weeks, she's suffering from a number of symptoms. Depressed mood, especially in the morning, decreased appetite during the day, insomnia, she has difficulty falling asleep. She also moves more slowly, and she's very tired, has little energy to do things, and also has problems concentrating. So it's quite hard for her to do her work. And according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders that we currently use, the DSM-5, then Sarah fulfills criteria for a depressive episode current. So why am I presenting this case? Well, I want to ask you, the audience, how many symptoms do you think are possibly affected by the circadian system? And this is not a memory test. I will show you the symptoms. And please use the chat to respond. So you can respond a number, or you can respond something like a few of them, or none, or all of them. So curious to see what you respond. All, I see. Okay. All. It's consensus. That's great. Then I don't have to explain too much, because indeed we think that all of them are indeed related to the circadian system. Mood is known to have fluctuations, circadian fluctuations, and especially positive affect, appetite, sleep, of course. The circadian process is one of the two processes that signal sleep, activity, and cognition. Cognition is also having a circadian rhythm, cognitive performance. Nice. So we're on the same page. And now, why study the circadian system in depression? Why is it important? Well, I want to first introduce you to the research domain criteria, which is a framework that perhaps, I don't know, chronobiologists might not be very familiar with. Is mostly from the psychiatry or psychology world, but maybe you are. It's developed by the National Institute of Mental Health, and it started in 2009 as a different system to the traditional system of just studying psychiatric disorders and symptoms, because they were too heterogeneous. So just with the symptoms of depression, which according to DSM are 9, and a person should fulfill 5 out of 9, you have all kinds of possible combinations that mathematically can be up to 1,000. So because of this heterogeneity, the system was developed that researchers should look more at systems within disorders and across disorders. So for example, someone can study the negative valence system. So fear, anxiety, threats, how does someone perceive threats, or positive valence, like motivation, reward, or cognitive processes, or social processes. And we are focusing here on the last system, that of arousal, and specifically on the circadian rhythms. So you can see that sleep and wakefulness is another system on its own. So I will not be also going too much into detail on sleep and wakefulness, because it's, yeah, you can have another webinar, and there has been also one on sleep by Tom DeBoer. So we're going to focus more on circadian rhythms and depression. And these arousal and regulatory systems, you can study, also the other systems, you can study them at different levels of analysis. So from genes to molecules, cells, circuits, physiology, behavior, self-report, and paradigms. And it's a lot. I will not be covering all of this today, but I will just tap on genes. We have some evidence on genes and depression in the circadian system. Some physiology, I'm going to just give some examples of melatonin research. And my main focus is on behavior and self-report. So really on a clinical picture, and trying to arrive to a paradigm and treatments. So in this webinar, I will talk about depression and circadian correlates, namely chronotypes. So I think chronotype is a good circadian proxy at the behavioral level. And I will also talk briefly about chronotherapy of depression, and specifically light therapy. Okay, so let's start with the depression and chronotypes. Just to make sure everybody is on the same page, what we mean when we talk about chronotypes, well, it's about the internal circadian rhythm or the body clock of an individual. And this body clock influences the sleep, the cycle of sleep and activity, but it can also influence your rhythm of when you eat or when you like to do perform activities in a 24-hour period. So this, the chronotype is usually measured using a self-report. And one instrument that's been very commonly used is the morningness eveningness questionnaire that assesses usually the preferred timing of performing activities. So it asks you like, when do you want to give a presentation, rather in the morning or in the afternoon? And later on, the Munich chronotype questionnaire was developed that assesses precisely the sleep-wake timing during work days and free days, and you calculate the mean sleep. And the difference between the two is also that the first one is categorical, so it categorizes people on morning types, intermediate types, evening types, whereas the Munich chronotype questionnaire is a continuum. So from early, being an early type or intermediate type or late type. The research I have used and I will present have used both interchangeably. And there has been lately a preference for the Munich chronotype questionnaire, but a lot of research is really consistent also when you use the MEQ. So circadian rhythms, when we talk about circadian rhythms, we talk about these cyclic phenomena within a period of approximately 24 hours. And these rhythms can be variations, for example, in core body temperature or melatonin or cortisol or alertness, and it can be in relation to chronotypes, for example, either earlier or later. In the rhythm, in the internal rhythm. Now moving on to our first topic of analysis, the genetic part. Genes have been lately associated with chronotypes and with depression. So the heritability estimate as shown in twin studies is about 0.42 for chronotypes and 0.37 for depression, so around 40% for both. And just to put this into context, this is sort of an average heritability estimate because, for example, it's not highly heritable compared to schizophrenia that is 70 or 80% heritable. But it is interesting that they have a similar heritability estimate. And it is also noteworthy that there is genetic covariance between the chronotype and depression. So it's the same genes that account in both concepts, at least the 20% of them. Now, a number of GWAS analysis has been performed. So the genome-wide association studies, which look at the whole genome. This is a review here by Lane in Nature Genetics, and they summarize the association between depressive symptoms and well, here the risk to be a morning, if you're a morning person, the risk of having a depression or depressive symptoms is shown, and you can see. Maybe I will use the pointer. You can see that the risk for morning people is less, both for major depression and even less for depressive symptoms. So lower risk if you are a morning type. And what is this? This MR causal genetic is this Mendelian randomization technique that is done. statistically, and it can show that there is a causal association between the morning people and the risk for depressive symptoms and for MDD. It's a very nice review. It covers a lot of topics. I definitely recommend it for, goes beyond depression. It's more about general mental health and genetics and circadian rhythm. So I definitely recommend it. Now, moving on to the next level of analysis. After having seen some associations of genetic vulnerability in the circadian system and depression, we move to melatonin. And melatonin is, I think, the most well-known hormone from the circadian system. So if you ask a layperson, any hormone relating to sleep, for example, maybe they come up with melatonin. And melatonin has also been studied in depressed patients. And I'm going to show you here a very old paper from 1984. It's also interesting how papers were written back then. And I want to focus on these last two lines. So in the depressed patients, the levels of melatonin were low throughout the 24-hour period. And the depressives had a delayed onset of the dark phase of the rhythm. So this is a bit of a puzzle, what is meant by the dark phase of the rhythm. Well, we'll keep the delayed onset. So what the messages here say is that the melatonin levels are low and there is a delayed onset of the rhythm in terms of melatonin release. And this finding has been replicated also more recently, 2016. So we go almost 30 years later. Where, just to guide you through this graph. So on the y-axis here, you have the MADRS scores, which are depression scores. So the higher the scores, the more the depressive symptoms. And here is the concentration of melatonin. So you can see that people with little concentration of melatonin have the highest depressive symptom scores. And as depressive symptoms decrease, so they're less, the melatonin increases. So this is again bedtime melatonin concentration. So we don't really know if there is a delayed rhythm in the melatonin release, but we know that it is dampened, so it is less with increased depression. So this is more in relation to chronotypes and the findings related to chronotypes. As expected, right? The melatonin is later, so it has a later onset, but also acrophase and offset. So the phase angle is delayed in the evening types compared to the morning types. And this has been found in several research studies. The combination of both melatonin and chronotype and depression is more rare in studies. So we know of a kind of a dampened rhythm in depression, probably a delay, but it's not exactly sure of whether it's both or not. So moving on to the topic really of chronotype and depression in terms of diagnosis and in terms of symptoms and self-report. I will present you with the latest meta-analysis where the diurnal preference of chronotype has been associated with depressive symptomatology. And they gathered 43 effect sizes from a total of almost 30,000 participants. So a lot of studies have been made, mainly in the last 15 years. And eveningness is associated with depressive symptoms, but with a small effect. And the authors also say that, of course, there is a kind of a systematic association. This is consistent, but because of the small effect, there's probably a lot of other reasons why a person having an evening type or being a late type is related, is also having more depressive symptoms. So the link might not be direct. We also did a review a bit earlier than the meta-analysis, and we found the association with depression in a lot of studies, but also with seasonal affective disorder, but also with sleep disturbances and poor lifestyle habits. So that's something I want to stay on a little bit more, to show that the chronotype is on one hand related to psychiatric disorders like depression or SAD, but also to delayed sleep phase syndrome and addictive disorders, and less so to anxiety disorders, for example. But at the same time, it's associated with a lot of behaviors here that are problematic, and these are really directly related with these psychiatric disorders. And these are sleep complaints, smoking and substance use, and poor dietary habits, and poor cognitive emotion regulation. So these behaviors could also be as explanations why the eveningness is related to depression. So we talked about through the meta-analysis that more depressive symptoms are found in children, adolescents, and adults that are evening types. And it's important to isolate from those studies, also the meta-analysis, the prospective studies. These are quite useful to answer the chicken and the egg question, because, you know, a lot of people, including myself, think, you know, is it the evening type, the eveningness that causes the depression, or is it the depression that makes the person sleep later and later and later and shifts their rhythm? And therefore, eveningness is related to depression. It's not an easy question to answer. Some prospective studies show that, especially one is in adolescent samples by Haraden, they show that eveningness predicts the onset of a depressive disorder. So that's some evidence that the shift comes before the depression. And we found that eveningness predicts higher depressive symptoms a year later in students, so also along the same line. But we need, of course, more research that is prospective. Eveningness is also associated with chronicity, so with treatment resistance in depressed patients, and also increased psychiatric comorbidity. So having more psychiatric disorders next to the depression. So in trying to understand the link between chronotype and depression, I want to look with you at several factors. Sleep, for example, as a potential explanation, or psychological factors, or somatic health factors, and lastly, social jet lag. So let's start with sleep. And to understand whether sleep is an explanatory mechanism linking eveningness and depression. Now, sleep is a very general concept, and it has been measured in different ways, understandably. So evening types have lower sleep efficiency than morning types. They also report lower subjective sleep quality or more hypersomnia, nightmares, and more frequently use sleep medication. But there are discrepancies between the objective and the subjective sleep data. So more subjective differences are found between evening types and morning types. And also which sleep outcome you use can make a difference. So are you using sleep quality or sleep duration or insomnia? It's of course can be very broad in research. They use different concepts. That's not a problem, but the research is scattered, so we don't have a clear picture yet. I think most studies do show that eveningness is an independent risk factor for depression and is not fully explained by sleep parameters. So you have several studies that have checked also in mediation analysis, and they find that sleep is an unsuccessful mediator. And an independent risk factor, eveningness is an independent risk factor. So I think we need more research on this, and we also need to characterize the outcomes better, and eventually in reviews and meta-analysis, this will be further clarified. Now, understanding the link between eveningness and depression, you can also look at more psychological vulnerability factors. Although this might not be intuitive for the circadian system, so it's like that you look at another parallel system and how that is related to the circadian system with chronotype as a proxy. But it could be that they do interact. And in my hypothesis of light therapy later on, you'll see also how that is possible. So in one of the studies I did in the past, I looked at cognitive reactivity, which is a vulnerability factor for depression. It's the tendency to respond with dysfunctional cognitions. So to think negatively about things, even when you're not depressed. So people have a high cognitive reactivity even outside a depressive episode. And we know that if you do have high cognitive reactivity, you are more vulnerable for depression. This is something we showed in other studies, not this one. And in this one, we examined the association with chronotype. And as you see in the graph, we saw that even late types have increased cognitive reactivity. This is a large sample of about 1,800 people from the Netherlands study of depression and anxiety. And we also found a mediation of cognitive reactivity between eveningness and depression. So that is some positive evidence of, specifically negative thinking. But here in another group in England, Ray Norbury has examined chronotype and emotion regulation, and they found that eveningness is associated with increased expressive suppression of emotions and reduced cognitive reappraisal. Now, these are very technical terms. What do they mean? It means that evening people are less likely to express their emotions, so they have an expressive suppression or as an emotion regulation mechanism, and they also are less likely to reappraise situations, so reevaluate situations in a healthy way. And interestingly, we found similar results in an independent study in students. So in this study, eveningness was associated with increased self-blame and reduced positive reappraisal situations. So just like the previous study. And these emotion regulation strategies mediated the link between eveningness and depression. And it was in this study that eveningness also predicted depressive symptoms a year later. Moving on to the brain level of emotion regulation, the team Norbury found that late chronotype is also associated with enhanced amygdala reactivity, which is amygdala is in the limbic system, in the emotional center of the brain. And they also found the reduced frontal lobes, so prefrontal cortex and limbic system functional connectivity, so that the connection between the areas was reduced, which is a very typical pattern that we also observe in depression. So heightened amygdala reactivity in depression and also reduced frontal limbic functional connectivity. And this was observed in late chronotypes. So there's quite some evidence also from independent groups showing that there are some psychological vulnerability factors related to eveningness and depression. And moving on to the somatic health factors and health behaviors or maladaptive health behaviors. Evening types, as we said before, they're more likely to smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, maybe also related to the fact that they're more awake at night. They also have poor dietary habits, exercise less, and they're also less exposed to light. Could also be because of the delayed rhythm and being less outside. But these factors have not been systematically investigated in both in terms of chronotypes and depression, so as mediators in the link. So I think here again, more research is needed. This is a growing field, and we will know more about these behaviors and their relationship to assisting in developing depression or maintaining depression. With regard to activity, I just want to present some of research we've done in collaboration with Groningen, where we show that the level and the timing of physical activity in a depression as compared to control group. Here is the green line is acute depression, and the total depression is the last 6 months. And you can see a clear dampened rhythm in the depression group compared to the control group. This dampened rhythm was also marginally associated with also a later timing of the rhythm in the acute depression group. Again, more research, I think, will enlighten us, especially more with regard to the timing. I think it is quite understandable that the depressed group has lower activity, but also with regard to the timing of the rhythm and the phase of the rhythm, we need more research. So last but not least, is evening type related to depression because of social jet lag? Simply, could that be the case? So just to introduce the social jet lag concept, in case you're not familiar, but I think most people here will be. So social jet lag is the misalignment between the internal clock and the social clock. It was developed by Till Runeberg, and there's also a nice review by him in 2019. And it basically means that your internal clock, for example, might say it's time to be asleep. If you're a late type, you go to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and when it's 9 o'clock and you have to go to your lecture, that's your social clock, then it's very difficult for you. And what can happen is that you still wake up, you go, And then in the weekend, you decide that you're going to sleep longer. And because of that, then again on Monday, when you have to switch back to your lecture, you have this social jet lag because you have messed up your clock, basically. So social jet lag in a previous study we did was not related to depression and not to depressive symptoms. And the research is quite mixed. If you look, I did an overview, and several studies show an association. So the first 4 studies, an association between social jet lag and depressive symptoms or depression, but also other studies show no association. So we still put a question mark on this one, as it is unlikely that it's the sole explanation why eveningness might be related to depression. So concluding this part of the talk, the chronotype and depression part, understanding the link between eveningness and depression is difficult, and I think it's a single pathway is unlikely. And it is rather that evening types may be subject to smaller and cumulative vulnerability factors that may increase the risk for depression over time. So it is also the factors that are around the eveningness chronotype or the late type, which can be paired with dysfunctional emotion regulation, for example, or certain behaviors that you're less exposed to light, or that you use more substances, or a dampened rhythm of melatonin, or a really delayed rhythm. And social jet lag can possibly play a role, but there are likely to be inter-individual differences here. So it's a model in development. It's far from complete, and there has been really increasingly research on the topic. The last years, chronotype has been associated with personality traits and all kinds of things, mortality too. So I think in the next 10 years we will have a better picture and understanding. So
sorry to interrupt, 5 minutes left.
5 minutes, okay. It is a smaller part of my talk, so but very interesting, I think. Moving to the next step of chronotherapy of depression, and more specifically light therapy. So yeah, why light? And because light is one of the main zeitgebers, environmental cue that stimulates the clock through the eye and the SCN, sending signals to the rest of the body. This is a review by Snell et al. And light therapy, I just want to give some history, was developed more than 100 years ago by Niels Ryberg Vincent, who received also the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for his work on the therapeutic effects of light, mainly for skin disorders like lupus. And this is how it looked back then. You would put people on a bed and put this light on top of them. So a few years later, not many, here you see a child in 1928 receiving light therapy, again for skin diseases. But later on, people realized, okay, this is UV light, and it can also be harmful for causing melanoma, etc. And it was until the 1980s that Rosenthal was studying this, was doing experiments on the National Institute of Mental Health, and studied the effects of light. And the term seasonal affective disorder was coined. And from that on, we really picked up on this type of therapy and type of depression. So light therapy has been mostly used for seasonal affective disorder, but now we'll also show you data that it's also works in non-seasonal affective disorder. Just to understand what we mean by seasonal affective disorder, in a lot of people's minds, it's just winter depression, but that's not the case. It can be any season, any depression with a seasonal pattern. So according to the DSM criteria, it needs to be present at least 2 consecutive years and during the same season. Usually it is the winter, yes. And the symptoms diminish after the season, and increased appetite and sleep are observed as symptoms. But other symptoms can be equally severe to non-seasonal MDD. So you might still have suicidal ideation or feelings of worthlessness paired with the seasonality. And the prevalence is 9 to 10%. Of course, it depends on which country you look. And also between countries, I see differences even with the same latitude. So I was quite surprised that Iceland has quite low rates of seasonal affective disorder, increased adaptability there compared to Canada areas, for example, that are in the same latitude. So just to tap a little bit on the mechanisms of light therapy, still a field under development. We don't know a lot, but we are starting to understand. Well, this is a review by the Hadar team, where they show that light is perceived by the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which express melanopsin. They can either have an indirect pathway through the SCN and the circadian system, or they can have a really direct pathway to mood. And I'm gonna go to my next slide to explain how this is possible. With the next review that is more recent, is Chen et al. 2021. In a quite complicated model, as it's seen at first, but it's quite simple. So again, light comes through the retina, rods and cones for the visual system, and can still go to the amygdala. And the circadian regulation circuit is this part, the purple, going to the SCN, and then to the locus coeruleus, and then possibly through norepinephrine. This part, the dotted part, is still under investigation, so we don't have a lot of evidence about this hypothesis. So still going to the limbic system and then to the prefrontal cortex. But there are also 3 motion regulation circuits, so that light can have an effect directly to the limbic system, as the yellow line or the red line. And the blue lines, that the light can have an effect directly on the amygdala, and there is already some research on this, and possibly affecting also the connectivity with the prefrontal cortex. Of course, the systems also work together, also the emotional system with the brainstem. So it is a nice start, and I think with more MRI studies, we will be getting a better picture of this and a better understanding. Also, the reviews on bright light therapy has really increased over time. Here you can see from 1995 to 2020, in the last 15 years, a big rise on mood disorders and neurocognitive disorders, which means there has been an increased interest in the effect of light in mental health disorders. And I want to update you with an update meta-analysis for light therapy in non-seasonal depression, because yeah, first, of course, many studies were just on seasonal depression, and that's usually what people think, light therapy just works for the seasonal depression. Well, no, it also works for the non-seasonal depression. And in this meta-analysis, they reviewed 23 studies, and the effect size was moderate, I would say, 0.4, which is also not very different than effect sizes seen with antidepressant treatments. So they also did some subgroup analysis in this meta-analysis, and they showed that the light therapy works best in outpatients, people with less comorbidities, in the morning compared to other times and as a single treatment. And this last point is a bit contrary to another meta-analysis, which showed that if it's an adjunctive therapy, you can have more of a medium effect compared to a small effect. So I think this, whether it's adjunctive to treatment or as a single treatment, we also need more research to understand this a bit more. So light therapy is really currently underused in mental health centers. Most mental health practitioners don't think to put their clients in a light therapy, even though it is likely to have an effect. It works for seasonal, but also non-seasonal depression. And the therapeutic efficacy is similar to first-line antidepressant treatments. So about 40 to 50% respond to this, but also to other treatments like CBT or antidepressants, cognitive behavioral therapy. We still don't know for whom it works exactly, so that's a space that we can improve. And also, what are the best conditions? So what is the timing of light therapy, and for whom, on the basis of chronotype maybe, or on the basis of your sleep-wake cycle, in what context? And this brings me to, I'm finishing, my almost last slide. To our future research in BioClock, where we will examine light therapy and its effects as compared to a condition in a light cafe. So in this context, compared to light therapy at home, and also testing whether personalizing the timing of the light therapy will help. And here Emma Visser, PhD student at TU Eindhoven, she'll be investigating this RCT, and Georgiana will be looking at the brain mechanisms before and after this RCT. And that was it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive questions.
Thank you very much, Niki, for your really interesting talk.